Oh, we're live now, right?
Yep, we are
I don't
now.
mind leaving my camera on.
All right.
Helps me get intimate with the crowd.
Feel free to talk to your stream.
Yay, thank you, Mom, Dad, the two people watching. It truly is an honor to have you. I'm sure you've heard me give this lecture at home so many times, but thank you for tuning in. Hopefully, there's no big internet connection, especially with the thunderstorm thing.
Let's hope so.
But hey. Hey, maybe while waiting, Tommy, how have you been? I guess see if I can open the stream on my phone as well. To the people watching, I'm sure we're all tired with online class and everything. Don't forget to get a refreshing iced cup of water. It can always go a long way to hydrate yourself. Just a random piece of advice from me. That's on the house. It's also Thursday, everybody's second least favorite day of the week. Only next to Monday. Give yourself a break if you need to. It can also go a long way. So Tim, how long do you expect this lecture to be? Because I actually haven't done a full gauge time of myself here yet.
The floor is all yours. So long as we have a Q&A after. So
Okay. Well, hopefully you're ready. Well, lucky for you, you don't have to stay here until any longer than 2 a.m. No, that's obviously too much. Even I can't rant about judging for that long. Okay, so that's how you move through the slides in preview. The chat gets to see me learn my own tech mere moments before I begin the lecture. Just a testament to how prepared I am, everyone. To the to the people listening, give me those Fs in the chat. Now we have almost just 2 minutes left until we begin everything. Oh, you guys flatter me. It's getting dark. Should also probably turn on my lamp. Yeah, that should about do it. All right, Tim, you there? It seems like if you're right about there being a slight delay, it's 5:30 by the time the chat or by the time the stream hears me say this.
Okay. Okay, so to begin, hello everybody. Welcome to the second lecture of the PDU workshop part 2. So before we begin with the introduction of our wonderful speaker, let's start with a few reminders. So please respect the rules of equity as you participate in the stream. Hate speech is prohibited and not tolerated. We have the capabilities to ban you from the stream. Use the stream chat for any questions or inquiries you may have during the discussion. These will be screened and forwarded to our lecturer. Please also note the stream is delayed by a few seconds, so please be patient as the questions are going to be forwarded and answered at the appropriate times as deemed fit by our lecturer. So without further ado, time to introduce him. He is a shining star in the Philippine judge circuit as of right now, with his most recent grand achievement being the overall best adjudicator of the Monash Australs of 2020. He's also a two-time top 10 adjudicator of Asia and also of the Philippines. Recently, he has chaired the grand finals of the IITB Open, HKPDS Open, Melbourne Pre-Australs, and a number of other tournaments. It is our honor to introduce to you Nicolas Lozano.
Hey everyone, Thanks for having me. If the chat was already flattering, Tim, you're by far the king. So, welcome everyone to this lecture. Firstly, I'd just like to thank the PDU so much for having me. It's truly both a humbling privilege and an honor to be able to share what I've learned in the last 2 years to everybody else, especially those aspiring to become better judges today. So, as you can see by the slides, I'm ready to begin. The main focus of my lecture now will be on how to improve as an adjudicator competitively. So if you're not sure what that means, I'm ready actually to first share a disclaimer. So note that this judge lecture in particular will not be a fundamental lecture. This isn't to say that if you're a beginner, you can't listen and participate in this stream without already having prior knowledge to adjudication. Rather, what I do mean to say is if your purpose or your agenda is to search for insight about particular foundations of adjudication, i.e., things like how to be a judge as a globally informed citizen, how to score debates, what are the different kinds of burdens depending on the type of motion. If these are the kinds of information you're looking for, I heavily recommend reading the general briefings created by the international majors of our circuits. But I also recommend the already brilliant lecture of Aloysius Bresnan, which can also be found on the PDU YouTube channel. So for those who are still wondering then, the more niche focus of my lecture will be improving as an adjudicator competitively. I'll be sharing the most useful tips, tricks, and systems I both have learned in my career to hone my skills, as well as use in order to in order to achieve what I have achieved. Given all of that, for the next 45 minutes to an hour, I'll mostly be sharing tips on three things. Firstly, how to weigh tricky exchanges, in particular, weighing opening against their own closing, and how to decide who wins in a diagonal debate. Afterwards, I'll be explaining about how to improve panel deliberations. Then lastly, I'll be sharing key tricks to improving your own oral adjudication. So I guess without any more further ado, let's then move on. Or I forgot to move on to the slide showing the agenda. But I guess without any more further ado, we can proceed with the first agenda, weighing tricky exchanges. So the one I want to begin with are the intra-bench exchanges. And note that in every intra-bench exchange, it's tricky because the teams you're comparing are teams that are arguing for one, very similar things, but two, using also very similar agenda and objectives in order to prove their merit or to prove their persuasiveness in a debate. And when you're comparing then opening and their closing, you also have to take note that there's two possible scenarios that could take place in the decision tree that is debate. One is the closing bench runs a very similar argument compared to their opening. The second is the closing bench argues a very different argument compared to their opening. Let's first talk about the first scenario, where you have to assess who won between opening and closing when the closing team runs a very similar argument to their opening. The first question you have to ask yourself when this takes place in a debate is, was this new argumentation a rehash? And note that a closing team that runs a similar argument does not immediately run a rehash, insofar as even if there are marginal differences, these marginal differences can make or break an argument, especially if these are things that are pertinent to the overall compellingness of a specific contribution. So as a tip from me, the things I would ask myself, or the things I would suggest you ask yourself to weigh or to classify the new argument as a rehash is to ask yourself things like, is this mechanization from the closing teams elucidated with more granularity? Which is to say, if the closing team was able to introduce the mechanization in a clearer way, with a more illustrative manner, perhaps this contribution is no longer rehashed because of this introduced mechanization. Maybe the shareholders in the closing team were introduced with more nuance. Maybe the opening team was unable to identify what exactly is important to the shareholder. If the closing team is able to identify this, this is already reason to believe this new contribution, even if it is similar, is not a rehash. In addition to this, there are things like impacts, where the impacts demonstrated to be more relevant to the debate, whether it be in tandem to the shareholder analysis or in tandem with the mechanization. Or maybe even the closing team was just more charitable to the engagement from opening opposition or opening government. Maybe the closing team was more willing to take into account the characterization that was built by the opening teams and use it in their argumentation. These are things that can be reasons to believe that a similar argument of a closing team is not anymore a rehash, even if certain premises and certain ideas are similar. So let's then say the answer to the first question, is it a rehash, is no. So the similar argument that closing runs is not necessarily a rehash. How then do you assess who won between opening and closing? Well, when it's not a rehash, it's not immediately true that the closing team wins the debate. So I would do like to point out that just because the closing team is able to extend, this is not justification enough to give the closing team immediately the win over their opening. insofar as it is the burden of the closing team to improve on the entirety of the opening case, and their new contributions must outweigh the totality of the argumentation that opening introduces. A few questions you can ask yourself to demonstrate to yourself and to panelists maybe in the deliberation later on whether or not closing team was actually able to improve on its totality are things like: one, maybe the closing team was able to introduce or patch up missing links in the opening exchange. If the closing team is able to do this, maybe closing team should be credited more for their argumentation. Or maybe there were crucial flaws in the argumentation of opening that made it impossible to credit opening for that argument. If the closing team then is able to introduce this analysis, perhaps that is reason to believe as well that closing is able to get more credit than opening. The main key takeaway here is, if you're able to identify that closing is extending from their opening, do not give them the victory by mere virtue of them being able to extend. Rather, dig deeper, give more nitty-gritty analysis, give more credit where it's due to opening, and ask yourself if this new contribution is something that is sufficient enough to believe that closing has already beaten their own opening. But let's then proceed to the other scenario. Like, what if it actually was a rehash? How then do you weigh the contribution of closing government then? If the similar argument of closing government or closing opposition turns out to be a rehash of their opening houses, you do not credit closing at all for that argumentation. The reason why this is important is, if you do, you are likely to end up doubly punishing teams in the opposition house or in the opposing houses for the same argument twice. Note that this is particularly problematic because the point in which an opening government is able to win their opening exchange, if it's true that you can just say the same thing again and beat opening opposition by saying the same thing again, it's likely that you're never going to have any diagonal debates ever, because all it takes for closing government to beat opening opposition is for them to repeat what had already been compellingly demonstrated by their opening at that point in time. But in tandem to this, if one argument turns out to be rehashed, it does not mean you should entirely dismiss the closing house altogether as well. It's entirely possible for the closing houses to rehash one argument, but win the debate on a more compelling second extension that they argue later on in the member speech, for example. Now let's move on to the second scenario of the first category, which is, what if the closing team just launches a completely different argument compared to their opening? Maybe they have a new frame, they introduce new shareholders, they elucidate the model and more of its facets, and try to explain how these new introductions are reasons to believe closing should win the debate. I believe this is a bit more straightforward, which is probably why I'll be spending a little bit less time on this. You have to compare the issues themselves. The point in which the issue, for example, that closing is able to demonstrate is proven to be more relevant, that's the only time you give closing to win in these scenarios. The way to assess whether or not the closing team is able to defend their issue are through the things I mentioned already to earlier, or the things I alluded to earlier, like one, the shareholder analysis. Was the closing team more willing to, or more able to demonstrate why their arguments exclusively benefit a shareholder, and why, for example, this benefit is so particularly important that opening not talking about this should cost them the debate? You shouldn't give closing team the win again by pure virtue of them introducing new shareholders and new issues. Again, just because they're distinct arguments does not necessarily mean closing should always get a win over opening. Instead, you have to give opening the benefit of the doubt, give them credit where it's due, and ask yourself which team was able to, in a more substantive manner, contribute to the debate with their inherent argumentation at that point in time. But the last thing I also want to mention before I move on to the next issue is, when you're comparing closing and opening, it's also very important to consider the opposing houses' contributions, insofar as the contributions of the opposing houses could change the current play of the debate. What is the current play of the debate? The current play of the debate is like the meta-analysis of the debate, which is to say what arguments are particularly most important given the exchanges that already happened. At that point in time, this can also modify or affect how you as an adjudicator weigh what ought to be prioritized by the closing houses. If the closing teams are better able to address the current play of the debate in a much more decisive fashion than their opening, perhaps this too can be a reason to give the closing team the win over their opening. In addition to this, if the closing team is able to extend, but what their extension is borderline irrelevant because they're not willing to discuss the crucial shareholders that the opening benches introduced, this is also a reason to believe the closing team should not take an edge over the opening at that point in time. So that's how I would, or in those scenarios, that's how I would weigh an opening against their own closing. These are the tips and tricks I would use, especially in these tricky exchanges between them. But what about the diagonals? So diagonal exchanges, how do you credit new material that the opening team cannot respond to? Note that this can happen in a variety of different ways, and it's not just the opening government versus closing opposition. It's not just opening opposition versus closing government. This too can be the deputy leader of opposition versus opening government, wherein the deputy leader of opposition reframes the debate in their deputy speech and then does not take POIs from the opening government at that point in time. This is a very tricky question, ladies and gentlemen, because admittedly, the answer to this question is that judges do have to perform their own independent assessment, especially because there are a lot of judgment calls you have to make subjectively when assessing the persuasiveness of certain contributions at this point in time. However, I can still share some crucial things to consider that I do feel a lot of judges do not consider as much as they should, and I do want to highlight these for the sake of this lecture. The first one being points of information. So the thing I want to emphasize the most is you as an adjudicator, especially when you're in BP, especially when there are these diagonal exchanges, you must emphasize the importance of points of information. Because while not accepting a POI does not immediately or should not immediately cost a team the debate, it is quite telling that they're not willing to give their diagonal exchange even 15 seconds of opportunity to respond to their new case at this point in time. What I would suggest then is you have to be punitive to teams that are not willing to, especially in light of them having entirely new frames in their speeches, not willing to allow their diagonals to at least raise a POI once during their contribution, during the substantive portion of their debate. The benchmark that most of the ad score of the world would suggest is if this happens, if the closing teams do not accept POIs, you treat the argument when in the deliberation as if they had already been significantly responded to, insofar as this is the only way we can be fair to the opening teams at that point in time. The reason why, in case you disagree with me, the reason why we are so punitive about POIs is that these are the only opportunities teams have to respond to their diagonals. Not accepting one is literally depriving your opponents the opportunity to respond to you. I think it's time we change or we start being more wary of teams that are able to win debates by not giving the opponents this chance of responsive opportunity. I think judges should start being more punitive, especially when these things occur a lot, especially in very close debates. On the other end of the spectrum, however, do not also blindly worship whatever was mentioned during a POI. If in the opposition whip speech, the prime minister raises a POI and the POI is just rambling about an issue that had already been deemed to be irrelevant at that point in the debate, it's not your obligation to just immediately credit whatever was said by the prime minister. The simple framework I would suggest is you credit POIs as if they were argued or as if they were introduced in the responsive portion of that speaker's speech. And if it were said during a speech, how exactly would you credit that POI at that point in time? The last caveat I would want to mention here is if a team does not take a POI because nobody raised POIs for them, you also shouldn't punish that team. It's not their fault that nobody's raising POIs at that point in time. So that's how I would consider POIs. Just to recap it very quickly before I move on. POIs are important. If a team is actively denying their opponents the opportunity to raise a POI, this is quite telling because it's a significant lack of engagement from that team because they're actively depriving their opponents the opportunity to respond to their entirely new frames at that point in the debate. If a team raises bad POIs, do not feel obligated to still credit them, insofar as we shouldn't also be blindly worshiping POIs launched by teams during the debate. Let's then move on to the next one, preemptive cases. So this is probably also another reason why long diagonals are tricky. Another way to assess whether or not a closing opposition beat opening government or if a opening opposition beat their closing government is to ask yourself, were the argumentation introduced by the opening teams in their initial argumentation preemptive enough or already responsive enough to the new frame introduced by the closing team at the latter part of the debate? There are a few ways you can do this. I won't be exhausting all of them. A way you can do this is to look into things like shareholders. You can look if, for example, the shareholders being defended by the closing team, were they defended already better in the opening half? Did opening do a better job explaining what the shareholders care more about? And if they're able to reach that goal better than the closing, perhaps even if opening is unable to respond to closing, they should win for these reasons. Maybe the mechanization of opening mitigates already the argumentation of closing. Maybe there was something discussed by the prime minister or the leader of opposition in the model that mitigates the significant impacts of closing's new reframe. Or maybe the opening had already explained why their version of the debate has to be the most important, whether it not be by principle or whether it not it be by current contemporary circumstances of certain landscapes in the debate. These are things that the closing team have to respond to. If the closing team argues with argumentation in isolation, it is quite telling that they're not willing to respond to the frames of the opening. We as judges, especially since these are tricky exchanges, have that obligation to be giving credit where it's due to the opening teams at that point in time. But of course, if the opening teams were given the opportunity to raise POIs against the closing team, but they're unable to significantly respond to closing team's argumentation, that too should cast a shadow of that on the opening team's persuasiveness insofar as they're unable to actually concretely and distinctly take down the new reframe in the opportunities they are given at the end of the debate. So those are the two main ways I would suggest teams use when assessing the long diagonals and the short diagonals of their debates. It's important, again, to consider POIs, but more importantly, we have to give credit where it's due when teams are trying to be preemptive. We can't expect the opening houses, of course, to be sidekicks. So we also have to be more lenient towards them in that regard at the end of the debate. So that concludes the first portion, actually, of how I would adjudicate the tricky exchanges of a debate. If you have questions about this, feel free to ask them later on in the Q&A. I will now be moving to some tips I want to share about handling a panel deliberation. So I will be giving some soft tips, and then later on, I'll be giving some practical advice. The soft tips I want to share firstly are mostly attitude-based. And because I notice a lot of judges enter the deliberation thinking otherwise, and in my opinion, it comes at the detriment of the quality of that deliberation. So the first thing I want to share, and something that I want to turn into something that is true, is that your panelists are not your enemies in the debate. The reason why I want this to be true, first of all, is because the life of a judge is difficult. I'm sure everybody knows this. You are asked to adjudicate the six, probably eight of the most brilliant people in the world in only 10 minutes on a field you're likely not an expert on in the middle of the night because it's the fourth round of a 3-day-long tournament. At that point, it would be wrong to suggest or insist that you always have the right decision at the end of the debate. It's wrong to suggest you will always catch everything that happened in the debate. It's wrong to insist that you alone are capable enough to give these speakers the decision they deserve for all their effort, for all their work. That's why it's important to remember that your panelists aren't just there for you to argue with, aren't there just for you to convince. They're there to help you. You can ask them things like questions about what you may have missed in the debate. You can ask them how they perceive specific argumentation. You can ask them how they felt about specific responses, even if you already agree with them to begin with, because you need these people to help you and they need you to help them. The point in which we are able to recognize that panelists aren't there to beat you. If you enter a panel discussion with the intent to beat everyone, I think you should start changing the way you approach these deliberations, because I do think that is a rather toxic mentality. I think for both the judges and the speakers, it goes a long way to consider that the people you are working with we all want the same thing. We all want to make the right call. What we can do is share our own thoughts about it, and we shouldn't be doing things like withhold information. We shouldn't be doing things like being punitive towards others for simply having for simply having different things in mind about the debate. The second soft advice I want to share is that nobody will hold it against you if you make a mistake. If somebody holds it against you when you make a mistake in a panel deliberation, I think these people are the ones who are wrong. Why is it so important to know this? And a lot of times we do have to concede that we can't make perfect decisions. As much as the ad score encourage us to not be biased, things like our own experiences, things like our nationalities, things like our own, for example, knowledge and experience have the tendencies to sway how we perceive certain argumentation, tend to sway how we perceive certain contributions. And sometimes we feel like when we're fighting against our own biases, we are making controversial decisions, or we feel like we're making the wrong choices. The thing I want to share here is if you feel like you're about to make a call that is correct, but part of you thinks you might be making a mistake by making this controversial call, and you worry that people will hold it against you that you're making this controversial call, don't feel worried. Because again, as I shared earlier, these people aren't like, if you're worried about debaters calling you out for making a controversial call, note that the debaters themselves are likely the ones who are most biased about the result of the debate. You have no reason to be biased for these debaters. It's likely you're the most objective shareholder during that round. So if you're making a controversial call, it's likely in the best interest of the debaters that you're making this call anyway. But more importantly, it's because, as I mentioned earlier, judging is an arduous process, and frankly speaking, no matter how good you think you can always be better. That's why it's always good to recognize and admit that yes, you can make mistakes. Sometimes it's necessary to make mistakes during the deliberation. It's better, I would say it's better to make the mistake in the deliberation rather than in the oral adjudication, because at least when it's the deliberation, at the best cases, you're surrounded with people who are happy to help you improve your decision making, improve your analysis of the case of the round. Or in the worst case, at the very least, they're happy to correct you. So there's no reason for these people to hold it against you if you make a mistake at that point in time. So these are just some two soft tips. Now I'll move on to some practical tips about handling a panel deliberation. The first one is just make sure your time is allocated equitably. So note that this is true for both chairs and for panelists. If you're the chair, it's important that you not only give everybody the equal time to speak, but also the equal opportunity to respond to each other's ideas. So similarly in a debate, it's not enough for us to just hear people argue. We also need to hear people explain how they feel about the contributions of other people. Similarly in a deliberation, it is pertinent. You give panelists, if you're the chair, the opportunity to share their thoughts about each other's contributions, about each other's decisions. The the second thing I want to bring up here is that you also have to be particularly responsible about your time. Note that in the vast majority of tournaments, you will not be given any more than 10 minutes to deliberate. If you are very lucky, the org.com will give you 15 minutes. Note that 15 minutes is not a lot of time, right? Especially if there's three of you who all want to share a distinct call about the round. At that point, if you're the chair, it's your responsibility to assure that everybody has equal opportunity. So it may look like, for example, everybody has 3 minutes to share their thoughts about the round. Then everybody has 2 minutes to respond to each other. Every time somebody speaks, you ask if someone is willing to change their vote, if at that point there is a dissent, or if at that point people do have different decisions. If everybody already has the same decision from the very beginning, it's still important that you give people this opportunity to both speak and respond to each other. If you're a panel, it's also your responsibility to be wary of chairs letting some panelists over time or the chair themselves going over time. You do have a right to be able to speak just as much as this chair. The chair being the chair does not mean they are inherently superior to you. You should be given just as much opportunity to share your thoughts about the call as much as the chair is given opportunity to share their thoughts on the call. So that's some practical advice for time allocation. Of course, if you aren't able to allocate your time properly, this is harmful because one, you might panic during the oral adjudication because you're not prepared, or two, you delay the tournament and this makes it worse for everybody else. Now let's move on to the last bit of practical advice. And I actually think for harkening back to the theme of this lecture, improving as an adjudicator, this is likely the most important thing I want to talk about. You need to make sure your discussion evolves when you're in your panel deliberation. Note that the deliberation is not just a fashion show. You don't just enter the deliberation, say what's on your mind, and pray that this convinces everybody else that you're right. In a lot of instances, you need to be able to integrate what was introduced by everybody else into your own decision, especially if you're speaking second or third. Otherwise, it'll be very difficult for the deliberation to move forward if everybody is just arguing their version of events. So, for example, if the chair, if after there's a three-man panel and one of you has a minority decision, maybe everybody thought closing government won, then, or say two people thought closing government won, then one person thought it was opening opposition. You let the person who thought opening opposition won speak first. Then when the person who thought closing government thought won speaks, they don't only speak about why they thought opening opposition did not win. You must also integrate what the other panelists had already discussed. You must be willing to integrate this into your own material. Similarly, if a leader of opposition in a debate does not integrate the prime minister's argumentation, it is very uncompelling for the leader of opposition to do this. I would say the same logic and principle should apply to panelists who are not willing to integrate the deliberations consensus into their own ideas. So this is not only good for the deliberation itself. I would say if you want to stand out as a panel, that's something that is crucial to your performance, especially because a lot of people feel like being panel is a arduous, disempowering position. I say this is how you turn that around. If you're able to integrate the chair's thoughts, spin them against the chair, this is when you're more likely to introduce this kind of enigmatic, kind of charismatic approach to deliberations. I think this is also how you're able to improve the quality of the OA later on as well. But also, like frankly speaking, probably get a high score too. The second thing I want to share is that you shouldn't be afraid to change your decision. I would insert everything I mentioned earlier about judges simply not being the perfect beings we would like to be, and that being wary that we might make the wrong call immediately after the round is crucial to being able to acknowledge what exactly might have had been the correct call. In tandem to this, I would say that if you're the chair, you shouldn't be punitive of your panelists who are willing to change their decision. If you're the panel and you're changing your decision in addition to this, it's also quite important that you're willing to do things like one, be clear why you change your mind. So don't just give a 3-minute speech explaining why you think 001. Hear what the other panelists had to say. Then simply say, I changed my mind. I will also vote for closing government. I think it's pertinent to the discussion, especially if you're not giving the oral adjudication. It's pertinent to the chair to understand what changed your mind. So you say things like, initially, I thought opening opposition won this issue because of this contribution. But after listening to what the chair said, I realized that there was this particular argument I was not giving enough credit to. When I give it more credit, I realize it responds actually to the characterization of opening opposition. That's why I changed my mind, which is why now I'm willing to agree that closing government won the debate. This is something, again, if your objective is to improve as a panelist, this is something that, again, is crucial to making it clear to the chair what exactly are your thoughts. Insofar as, in a lot of instances, we don't really give a series of structural frameworks to assure that panelists are being graded fairly. The least we can do is assure that the least we can do as panelists is make sure we're doing our best. The most compelling panelists I've encountered are those who are able to do things like this. People who are willing to integrate each other's materials into their own analysis, but also people who are willing to not just change their minds, but make it clear to everyone why they are changing their minds. The third thing I want to share is also not to be stubborn. So if it is true that it's not compelling to just simply be changing your mind for no reason, it is equally as uncompelling to be adamant. It is equally as uncompelling to be stubborn in the debate, especially when you're not willing to, or when it becomes very apparent that you're not willing to believe certain things. I wouldn't say being stubborn is inherently wrong. Rather, I would say if you're going to be stubborn in a deliberation, make it clear to everybody what is your influx point. You agree that some things may be true from your panelists, but you won't be willing to change your vote until something is proven true about maybe the opening opposition case. You won't be willing to change your vote until a specific question is answered. The reason why this is important is not only are you making it clearer to everybody what is important to you, which is why you're giving a certain team to win, it also might actually improve the quality of the deliberation as well, because now the other panelists will be more willing to share their thoughts on these specific things that might be holding you back from giving a certain team the win. Again, this not only is beneficial to the speakers and to the deliberation itself because it allows us to introduce a fruitful, more discursive deliberation, but it also makes you, for example, clearer because now both the panelists and the chair can have a better understanding of what exactly you valued in the debate. So these are the three things I would share. I'll just like quickly recap them. The first one is that it is important you enter the deliberation with a mindset that these people are there to help you and that you need to help them. Entering the deliberation with a mindset that these people are your enemies is likely going to lead to a toxic deliberation and would make it much more difficult, not just for the chair to give the OA, not just more difficult for the speakers to get the decision they deserve. It'll make it more difficult for you because you have to deal with all these toxic insecurities in the deliberation. Secondly, when you're in the deliberation, your time is the most precious resource you have. Make sure it's used as efficiently as possible. And thirdly, make sure you're willing to evolve with the discussion because this is how we get the most discursive form of a deliberation possible. So that concludes the second part of my lecture. I'll move on to the third and the last, which is a few tips to improving your oral adjudication. Note that I won't be giving you how I give my oral adjudication. If you want to know how I give my oral adjudication, maybe I can do that in the future. But this is in particular more custom in the sense that these are tips that apply to everyone. And these are tips everyone can do to improve their style of adjudicating. So the first one that I want to talk about is note taking. So I want to share first the two common mistakes I see in a lot of judges. The first one is when they're the chair, they don't really change their notes, or the most that they get is they just parrot what happened in the debate into a paper. They don't write down what is going on in the deliberation. by the time it's by the time it's ready for them to give the oral adjudication, they frantically refer to what happened on their mind and their notes simultaneously. And what this does is they panic, or what happens is either they panic, or secondly, they forget what particular arguments were credited born particular issues. And while the decision may have been reflective of what the panel agreed to be the decision, the oral adjudication is no longer reflective of what the panelists agreed to be the reasons why the decision was given. The second common mistake I see a lot is the opposite end of the spectrum, and something I admit I was guilty of before, which is you then rewrite all your notes in a different paper, in a different mode, to make it appropriate for giving the oral adjudication, which is good for you, but bad for everybody else because this takes you around 30 minutes more. You delay the entire tournament. Or the ORCOM force you to give an OA on time and you panic because your notes are either half written or even less than half written. So you're forced to mentally give the oral adjudication to the speakers. And this leads to you forgetting a lot of important things, even if maybe the first half of your oral adjudication is organized well. So the reason why I bring these two mistakes up is, well, one, if you were someone who's guilty of this mistake, acknowledging that you might be making that mistake now is important in resolving it. I'll be sharing tips later on how to resolve it. But two, it's also just to emphasize the importance of note taking, and that note taking is a 3D. It's not I don't want to say 3D. Note taking is an issue that concerns not only how comprehensive you can take notes, how well you can organize notes, but how smart you are with using the notes to begin with. So that's when I now move on to the second tip. You need to ask yourself, what kind of notes do you want to take? You don't enter a debate thinking to yourself, I'm going to write everything that everybody said and then wing how you're going to give the oral adjudication from that. It's very important that prior to entering the debate, you already have an idea, you have a framework in your mind about how exactly you're going to be classifying certain contributions. Are you an adjudicator who likes to weigh in particular issues against each other? Maybe then you should be creating a system in your mind that you will be emphasizing issues in the notes you're taking, such that it's easier for you to identify the issues in your notes. If it's not that, maybe you're more inclined to use how the debaters themselves frame the argumentation, then maybe you should create a system of notes in your head already, like that's already classifying the contributions according to how speakers are willing to classify them. When this is particularly important because again, it saves brain power if your notes already are accustomed to the way you want to give your own oral adjudication. It helps if your notes are already fine-tuned to how you see the debate, how you recognize the debate. This is not only beneficial for the oral adjudication, but if you're a visual learner, this makes it so much easier for you to organize your thoughts. It makes it easier for you to compare teams. It makes it easier for you to share immediately to the other panelists how you saw the debate. Because not only are you helping yourself with your own brilliance, your own critical thinking, but your notes are actually reflective already of what's going on in your mind. And the memory aid is heightened intensely if it reflects what your mind sees the debate as. So that's what I would suggest as my second tip. Don't think that or if you really think it's something that suits you, fine. Your notes can just be a transcript of what happened in the debate. But it's important also to think of a system that reflects how you see the debate. And note that this system can be different things. It can be maybe you like to classify again certain argumentation, maybe you like to classify it based on what the speakers say, and so on and so forth. After you make the system, the next important thing is you have to choose the right platform for you. So what I mean by platform, it means that you shouldn't limit yourself to taking notes on paper. You shouldn't limit yourself to taking notes on pen. While this might seem like common sense to others, it might seem weird to others. I think it goes a long way to do things like one, use note-taking applications in order to make more comprehensive notes of the round. I know for me, and also take note that this is probably different per circuit because some circuits limit what you can use as aid in a round, so on and so forth. On my end, I know that our circuit allows us to use our laptops to take notes offline, whereas like obviously we're not allowed to access the internet, we're also not allowed to access dictionaries, but we're allowed to do things like take notes on Excel if you're the adjudicator. I found that Excel was a very easy tool to use for taking notes because I can do things like bold, I can do things like strike through, underline. I can organize the columns in a way that I'm able to emphasize particular contributions and organize it per team. Makes it much easier for me to visualize how I see the debate. I personally don't know other note-taking platforms that are available online, but I do know that there are many different platforms that people can look into. And I heavily recommend to everyone that you don't limit yourself to handwriting. Handwriting can be very like based on experience, it's just so much harder to write everything down than it is to type things down. In addition to this, you also like it's messier to just have papers clumped up all over your room. It's easier to store these online or in your laptop because you can organize them into folders that don't take up physical space in your own closet or in your own drawers. So what is the conclusion of this note taking? Be wary of the kind of mistakes you're making. Maybe you're not maybe you're not organizing your notes enough. Maybe you're too much of a parrot. With this in mind, you think of the system that is crucial to you or important to you or something you're comfortable with using. Then lastly, after you identify a system in your mind, think of the right platform you can use to be able to fix or to be able to reflect that system. The next thing I want to talk about are just a few basic exercises and things you can do by yourself to improve as an adjudicator. So what's really important here actually is, well, basically it's a lot of hard work. The first one is recording yourself, and this might be very difficult for others, but trust me, it is important. The analogy I would link this to is like imagine a chef who never tastes their own cooking. Imagine a singer who never hears their own voice. Like imagine an athlete who doesn't know how they perform. Similarly, if you're an adjudicator who hasn't heard themselves give an oral adjudication, it is far more difficult for you to improve because your sole source of information or the feedback of other people, or if you don't approach feedback, your own source of information is your idealized version of your oral adjudication, what you thought you said in your mind when you were giving the speech. But frankly, when it's true that a lot of times you debate, you think you say one thing, in reality you said another. When judges say one thing, it's also very true that they may say one thing but actually like they mean one thing but say something entirely different. Recording yourself is a crucial first step to overcoming these biases. And while at first it might be uncomfortable for you because it's cringy hearing yourself speak, it's even cringier to hear yourself speak for hours on end. But trust me when I say that if you're really looking into improving as a competitive adjudicator, it helps to one, record yourself, give oral adjudications. It helps to give oral adjudications to already pre-recorded debates online. It helps even more to watch the same debate multiple times, maybe months apart, and see if you would have given the same oral adjudication, see if you improved your own oral adjudication for that debate as another metric of whether or not you're improving or not. This is also a way to see if your perceptions on debate change. If you think you're getting rusty, this could also be a way to go back to shape or to warm up prior to a round. The second one, read the rules of debate. This might seem tenuous or this might seem arduous. This might seem gratuitous to people who are already tenured judges. I would say while that might be true, the purpose of reading the rules of debate isn't to understand the rules of debate. If you don't understand the rules of debate, obviously you should read the rules of debate. But if you already understand the rules of debate, it's still good to read the rules of debate because personally, it has been a good warm up for me. Every day, every night before a tournament, I make it a point that I either read the briefing of the tournament if it is already available, or I read the briefing of Worlds, I read the briefing of Australs, of EUDC, because these are ways to reintroduce into my mind, to make it fresh in my mind again, things like what I should be using as metrics of persuasion, pitfalls I should be avoiding in terms of biases, burdens I should be considering in specific types of motions. Because while we might confuse, for example, while we might be active every weekend, sometimes we tend to deviate ourselves from these things and focus too much on the job itself. We focus too much on judging that sometimes we forget how to judge, why we're judging. Reading the rules of debate is not, in my opinion at least, not only a refresher course that is necessary for judges to do, especially if you're new to debate, but it's also a good warm-up because especially if you think that maybe your performance has been getting worse as time progresses, as you've been getting more tired, you've been getting more exhausted. This is like a good recalibration you can do to get yourself back on pace. And the third and last thing that I would say has actually contributed a lot to my own development. Ask feedback from speakers about your oral adjudication. So many time and time again, I see judges get asked for personal feedback, but judges never asking for personal feedback. If they're the panelists, they don't ask for personal feedback from their chair. If they're the chair, they don't ask for personal feedback from teams. I think asking for personal feedback goes a long way, especially when you consider the simple idea that judging is basically, or not, when you consider this idea that it's only half the battle to have the right decision. you need to convince everybody that your decision was right as well, because judging is a lot more similar to marketing than it is to law. The reason why I would say this is true is because it is, right? It doesn't matter that you had the right call. If you're unable to explain to these people why you were right and they don't buy your decision, they don't want to buy your product. This is the analogy to marketing. They won't give you a high score. They won't be convinced by you. They won't think you're a good judge. If the product you're pitching to them, you pitch it to them in a very poor way. And while you might think that, okay, simply getting better as a judge on your own is one way to improve, and I won't say that isn't the way to improve, remember, you're not the one judging yourself. It's these debaters. Even if you think these debaters are unreasonable, it won't change the fact that they must give you feedback and you must be ranked based on these feedbacks. Given all of that, then, as given all of that, then the first thing I want to share is it is pertinent you ask for feedback. It's pertinent that you don't disregard this feedback and you take it to heart, because these are the most important opinions about your oral adjudication. Not yours, not what you think, not what the briefings think, but what the debaters think. The second reason actually why I would say asking for feedback is a good thing is you will be surprised how many teams actually give good feedback. I think it's a good positive reinforcement at times to hear a team truly overjoyed that you understood their contributions, truly happy that someone was willing to listen to them. When it's round three, for example, in a 3-day long tournament, it's these teams that remind me why I began judging to begin with. It's hearing them say that they're happy to have been heard. That reminds me that that's why I joined to begin with, to be able to speak my mind to a group of people who are willing to listen to me. I think judges should be given that same privilege. That privilege can only manifest itself through feedback. And yes, sometimes we might be greeted with harsh criticism from debaters. We might be greeted with very, very harsh words. I think, one, if it's harsh, a lot of times these aren't founded. No, like, a lot of times these are founded with true insight about your oral adjudication, and sometimes we do have to take it. On the other end, these people say nice things, and these nice things are really nice to hear. And I think judges do need to hear this, not only for their own sake, but also for the sake of debate as well. So those are the two reasons why I would suggest asking for feedback is one of the most important things you can do in improving. So the last thing, and this is now like the last bullet point I want to share. And if you haven't been listening until now, don't worry. This is actually one of the most important things in this entire lecture. After this, we can then proceed to the questions. It's important to create your own framework for debate. So if at this point at this point you probably agree with me that there's different schools of thought to adjudicating. There's different briefings introduce different ways to measure persuasiveness. Different people look at debates differently. We classify ideas in our minds differently. And regardless of whether or not you agree with me about everything I've said so far, you must at least agree with this idea that you must create the framework that you yourself are comfortable with using. And the reason why that's so important is if your job is to convince everyone else that a certain decision is true, trust me when I say you won't be able to do that if you can't convince yourself. So now that you know that you have to create a framework for yourself, what are the standards I would suggest you should use in creating your framework? The first one is your framework should be able to measure persuasiveness. This is the most simple thing of framework. This is probably the most rudimentary, fundamental part of your framework. If your framework is not something that can be used to measure persuasiveness, it's likely to be a bad framework insofar as the sole purpose the judge serves in a debate is it's their responsibility to assess how persuasive teams are and communicate back to these teams who was the most persuasive. The second standard I would use in assessing if your framework is good is how comparable your framework is. So it's one thing to say you can measure persuasiveness, but your framework must be something you can use to compare the persuasiveness of different arguments also. Because obviously, as a judge, you can't just say all four teams are compelling, therefore all four teams won. You're forced to make judgment calls on very compelling arguments from all teams and explain why one team is better than the other. And the last thing and the thing I will leave you with before I proceed to Q&A is the most important standard of your framework is it must be something you are comfortable with using. And that's because ultimately, judging is subjective. And that's not going to change anytime soon. Regardless of how many briefings are made, regardless of how much better the debate community becomes in the next 10 to 15 years, every judge introduces something new to the debate, like how every speaker introduces something new to their arguments. Every judge comes with different biases, comes from different backgrounds. I think it's time we started embracing these. But rather than just embracing these, it's also important that we are wary of these, and that if you believe that a certain way of debating is true and everybody else says you're wrong, you shouldn't just adhere to how everybody else sees debate. Rather, I would say that it's more important you're comfortable with how you see with your own frameworks, because this is how you're more willing to engage in fruitful discourse. This is when you become more genuine with the speakers about giving feedback. This is when you're likely to give a decision you yourself enjoy, you yourself believe in. Because debate is still a game, guys. Debate's supposed to be fun. And for me, it's not fun if you're just going to conform to what everybody else thinks should be true. It's not fun if you don't believe in what you're saying. It's not fun if you're going to give an OA that's 10 minutes long, but ultimately at the end, deep down, you don't believe in anything you just said. So stick to your gut when you're the judge. Keep in mind everything I've said before that. But if you can't, it's always just more important to enjoy what you're doing. That can only happen when you're comfortable with what you're saying. And yeah, so that concludes my lecture. Special thanks to the PDU again for having me, to Irene De La Cruz for helping me make this PowerPoint, even though it's very late. Everybody who sent me questions before this lecture, I really appreciated that as well. It helped me guide the content. And to the people who have shared feedback with me in the last 3 years of my career. So I guess now we can proceed to the Q&A. Tim?
Yep, so for everybody who's on the stream, please feel free to send your questions in right now. Thank you.
Ooh.
You can chill, drink water for a bit while they file in.
Truthfully speaking, like this is, I haven't given a 1 hour, well, it's almost been an hour, but not quite. I lectured this long in quite a while, so you know. My throat is not in the same. My throat is not as young as it used to be. Maybe while waiting for questions, we can share some of our favorite judge stories. Do you have anything you want to share, Tim? I have another miscellaneous piece of advice. Between debates, especially since now we're given the freedom to do online debating, get as comfortable as you can. Make sure your setup is something you enjoy being in. Debate is already like as stressful as possible. It's good to do things like one, listen to music during prep. Don't cram your preparation for tournaments because that will really, really suck. Every round, I always listen to music, or every before the round, not during the round, obviously. And listening to like the Minecraft soundtrack, if you're familiar with that, has really saved me. I don't know, just one random thing I wanted to share. You don't have to listen to Minecraft soundtrack, everyone, but if there's something you really enjoy doing, something you really enjoy doing, something you can do at home, and something you can do quickly, try your best to keep your mental state, keep your happiness state as high as possible before what is likely to be a very stressful debate. Other miscellaneous thoughts, since nobody's yet asking me questions. Sometimes I still think about if whether or not voting is a better system than consensus voting. But my hot take on it is until somebody can give a concrete, like, here's the true reason why one is better than the other. I appreciate that in some circuits we do one, in some circuits we do the other. Because I know a lot of people think consensus is better, and I honestly don't have any strong arguments for otherwise. I'm still not entirely convinced either. Oh, so Venti sent a, sorry, I'm not sure if I can. I'll just read out the question. What are common mistakes that judges make in close rounds and how to overcome these? For younger judges, what mindset do you want to have when judging a high level room for the first time? Okay, so I'll answer the first question. What are common mistakes that judges make in close rounds? So the common mistakes include one, not going back to the basics. So I think whenever the round is very close, it's always important to keep in mind the most rudimentary parts of judging, which is things like one, how well were the shareholders described by this argumentation? How well was the impact described to me? In close rounds, normally the reasons why they are close is that teams were not clear. And a function of this lack of clarity is that judges have trouble weighing arguments as appropriately as they should. The common mistake here, firstly, is one, maybe, well, since there's a plethora of different possible hard debates, the first thing I would, rather than saying what the common mistakes are, I might answer that later on. I'll first say things you can do to patch those up. The first one is go back to the basics. Question your initial thoughts. Ask yourself if the teams really prove what they said. Because again, a lot of close debates are close because teams aren't clear. Secondly, maximize your panel. Again, these it's very the in a close debate, it's mostly close because teams aren't clear. And most of the time they're not clear as a function of how messy they were. When teams are very messy, judges will have very different interpretations than of that same argument. It's good to ask panelists how they credited particular contributions, whether or not you agree with how they credited it. Hearing what they thought they heard can give you more insight on these particular contributions, and this can help you piece together what exactly is most persuasive in the debate. The next question that Venti sent is, what mindset what mindset should a young judge have when adjudicating a high level round? That's actually a very good question. I would say again, firstly, don't enter the round thinking that the judges are your enemies, nor that the speakers are your enemies. Ultimately, recall that in the end, we all want the same thing to happen, which is that we all want to arrive at an appropriate decision for the round. So don't be intimidated. As much as possible, remember that you're given a plethora of different resources you can use to assure yourself that you're making good calls, you're making the right call. Secondly, I would say if you're scared that maybe because one team is of a particular institution, then that there's a lot of stigma behind them that you must vote for them to be the win. But in that round, maybe you thought they actually lost. Again, don't be afraid to make mistake. I'm not saying it's not a mistake. Don't be afraid to make a controversial call. Don't be afraid to make teams that are known to be good lose, because ultimately, if you're giving the right call, you're likely to be get treated with the good feedback. And a lot of times, good teams are reasonable or willing to accept whether or not they lose a debate. And if you approach them asking for feedback, I'm sure they would be kind enough to share to you their thoughts on your oral adjudication. Admittedly, this I will share, it is very difficult to escape those jitters initially because really there's no way around it. And even Aloysius mentions this in his lecture that experience goes a long way. I think if you're a new judge and you're given the opportunity to judge a high room, remember you're not there. Sorry, you're there with a plethora of different resources you can use to adjudicate fairly. Two, nobody will hold it against you if you make the wrong call. So since you won't be held against for making the wrong call, at the very least, go with your heart, go with what you're comfortable with, go with the decision you're comfortable with giving. But thirdly, ask for feedback. The one thing I would mention to you is that the AdJcore would not let you judge a higher room if they did not have faith in your capabilities. So if you're really a new judge and you see yourself adjudicating a high room, just take note that this is likely indicative of your performance, that the AdJcore sees your performance, says to themselves, this is a tough room, we'll likely have a close call, we will need our most adept adjudicators here, and they trusted you with that opportunity. This should likely, you don't have to be convinced by this, but I would say that this is you judging a high room is indicative already of your own performance. Believe in yourself, be comfortable with the decision you're making, and you're likely to be fine at the end of it all. The next question is, how do you make judgment calls in generally non-engaging debates? So I assume these are debates where teams just argue in isolation. Perhaps they don't explain to the judge why a specific frame is more important than the other. Maybe opening government has one model, opening opposition has an entirely different model, and nobody says why one model is better than the other. I would harken back to the keys to persuasiveness, including one, to what degree of granularity was the illustration introduced? Secondly, how relevant were the shareholders depicted to be? Thirdly, how impacted were the benefits of the argument to the shareholders. So even if you're not able to engage with each other, or even if you choose not to engage with each other, if opening government was able to, with in a far more compelling way, explain why their shareholders are the most important, independent of the responses to opening opposition, open government should beat opening opposition. If it's versus the if it's opening government versus closing government, you can harken back to what I said about weighing opening versus closing exchanges. Closing has the burden to improve on the totality of the entire argument that opening introduced. If they're unable to do this, opening should win. If it's opening versus closing opposition, be punitive to a CO who does not give OG the opportunity to respond to them via POIs. But more importantly, CO also be wary of preemptive cases that came from opening. Admittedly, like I know a lot of people like ask questions like, "Oh, what if the argument is equal in persuasion? What if they're entirely the same arguments?" And admittedly, there is no answer to that question because if it's true, if it somehow became effectively true that two arguments were equally persuasive, then nobody won. But from experience, I've judged, I think maybe almost 500 rounds in my life. I've never encountered a debate where one argument was truly equally as persuasive as another. So it's almost unlikely that that will ever happen. All right, there's actually a next question. If CG runs a badly constructed rogue extension that CO does not respond to, and CG's extension, if believed, wins over top half, should CG take first? Okay, this sounds like a judge test question that I need to think about. So give me like 10 seconds to think about it. So the way I would consider this is it is important to think about one, if opening opposition, did they have anything that could have preemptively responded to this? If the answer is yes, then maybe CG beat CO, but they aren't really able to beat OO because OO may have already preemptively responded to CG's badly constructed rogue extension. If CG doesn't really give a good illustration, but gives a very powerful meta, gives a very powerful shareholder analysis, then that might be room for considering that they should beat their own opening. Because actually, I think one thing I should consider, one thing that I think should somewhat be obvious is that CG beats CO here. I know the question itself doesn't mention the contributions of CO themselves, but I think if CO doesn't respond to CG and there's no mention of what CO's extension is, then CG should already be beating CO. And it's just a question of does CG beat the opening half? I think if, again, the recap of it would be if opening opposition had already preemptively responded to CG, OO beats CG. Again, be punitive to a CG that does not take POIs from OO. If OO had no preemptive responses, OO raises POIs to CG, but the POIs are rambling, irrelevant POIs, I would suggest that CG should beat OO because it's the responsibility of the opposition team to demonstrate why the rogue extension is mechanized poorly or constructed poorly. If they are given the opportunity to say it's constructed poorly but are unable to do so, then you as the judge cannot really step in and say it was constructed poorly, therefore opposition beat CG. So that's how I would weigh CG over opening and closing opposition. I'm actually admittedly a bit in the middle for comparing opening against closing because I think opening, albeit if they are able to illustrate their argument with more granularity, with more clarity, I think judge has to make a judgment call whether or not the illustration was important. I think it depends to what extent this construction is bad. So if the CG's extension is, oh, here's this mech, it will end world hunger, and gives nothing to explain why it will end world hunger, but explains why what world hunger is likely to be the most important thing, and nobody in OO and CO again is able to respond to it. I would say it's difficult to credit CG over OG because as an average reasonable person, it's difficult to credit this horrifyingly bad mechanization from CG compared to OG. But if it is, for example, of some realistic degree, however, it's just not argued extensively, I do think you also have to consider what is the current state of play of the debate. So if the OG-OO exchange, the main influx point was Is it where do we better help shareholders? Maybe you give OG you give CG the win because they're better able to answer the current state of the debate. If the influx point of the opening exchange is, oh, where do we, like, where is it likely to even happen to begin with? Is the argument true? OG should take the win because they're better able to answer the current state of the debate. I hope that answers your question. There was a lot of scenario analysis there, but I do think those are the scenarios you have to consider when assessing if CG beat their opening exchanges. But I do think they should beat CO. They should definitely beat CO if CO just does not respond to them. I think maybe we can give 5 or 10 minutes more for questions if there's still people who want to share.
All right, sure.
I'm also trying to think of questions to ask myself. If you need tips for how to handle a disorganized panel, it helps to I'll answer the question here just right after I answer this thought that I brought up now. If you're in a five-man panel, for example, and all five of you have different decisions, it's good to have it's good to map out everybody's decision. Try to identify what some people to some degree agree with, and try to pinpoint what is truly the most dissenting opinion in your five-man panel and start from there. So maybe, for example, there's five people with five different decisions, but three people think government bench won, and it's just a question of who got first, who got second. You can ask the two people who thought government bench lost to share their piece first about that. And from there, you slowly build towards the final decision. All right, so the next question was, do you have any tips on how to deliver OA which won't trigger an aggressive team? Okay, so I can share some tips. These are, I'm going to reveal some secrets to giving an oral adjudication to answer this question. Thank you so much for asking it. So, the reason why aggressive teams get triggered isn't because they're malicious, right? I think this is something people forget. An aggressive team isn't aggressive because they hate debate, they hate you, they hate the other teams. They're aggressive because maybe they were very passionate about what they argued, and they're worried that by a function of what the opposing team said, their own performance, and certain judge values, that you weren't able to credit them appropriately. So, or at least that's how I would diagnose the problem. Teams want to be heard. Most aggressive teams are aggressive because they fear that they weren't heard or that they weren't credited appropriately. If you somehow have the foresight to realize that a team you're about to give the fourth to is going to get the fourth is a very aggressive team, the simplest way to overcome this issue is to make it clear to them that you were able to recognize their contributions. So the simplest way of doing this is to summarize what they said in your oral adjudication, but this should not be the only thing you do. In tandem with like summarizing or making it clear to them what you were able to credit from their speeches, also take into account or make it clear to them why they lost and what still stood true in the end of their speeches. So very rarely does a fourth place team have their entire case responded to. Very rarely does a fourth place team have their entire argumentation debunked to the point in which you couldn't credit them for anything. And a lot of times the team will get fourth because even if some things were true from their speeches, it ultimately was not as persuasive as what the other teams argued. And framing your decision in that manner is a way to tame the aggressive nature of these individuals. So let's say OG got fourth in a round. They are aggressive. They're an aggressive team, hypothetically. And the hypothetical diagnosis is you're worried that their model, for example, was not understood by the other teams, or they are worried that their argument was not given credit because the closing teams did not accept UIs from them. Yet you still gave them the fourth. Say things along the lines of, we agreed as a panel that OG was not given the opportunity to raise a PI to closing, and that this cast a shadow of doubt on the engagement of closing opposition. But the reason why, in spite of all these things, we still think that opening government lost are for these reasons. We agree with opening government that they were able to prove X argument with X premise, and we will concede that there's no direct response to these. But the reason why this is still not enough for opening government to rank higher than the other three teams is for one, two, three reason. Then say something along myself. So yes, we agree with opening government. They proved X and they proved Y. But unfortunately, these things were not enough to overcome the other stellar contributions that the other teams introduced. Therefore, unfortunately, we had to rank them fourth. So I think the most important takeaway from this is aggressive teams aren't aggressive because they are angry. They are aggressive because they want to be heard. They're worried you didn't hear them. If you make it clear to them that they were heard and that you did everything in your power to consider their contributions in the debate, and you're able to reflect this to your oral adjudication, they will not be mad at you. They will assess you fairly. And I think this is not only how you should treat aggressive teams, this is how you should treat every team. Because every team wants to be heard and every team deserves to feel like they were heard in a debate. So I hope this answers your question. We have time, I guess, for one more question. Maybe one or two more questions.
All right.
I actually really like the question so far. Like, is there a way to make the questions appear at the beginning of the lecture? Maybe these are the things I wanted to talk about and not what I actually talked about. Actually, especially that last part, I do think that should have come out in the lecture itself, that teams just want to be heard, and if you don't make them feel like they're heard, you're not doing your job, or at least you're not doing your job properly. Like, I wish I knew that sooner. Like, it was something what I shared was something I only realized by both debating and judging. If you only judge, you'll never know. You would never realize that. If you only debate, you'd never realize how difficult it is to deliver that. Okay, I guess there's one more question. This can be the last question. How do you assess implicit responses? So I assume this is for diagonal response. This is for diagonal and for the like, OG versus DLO. Because the first thing I want to mention is implicit responses should not be given really too much credit. If you're given an opportunity to directly respond to something, yet you still chose to implicitly respond, this should cast a shadow of doubt on the persuasiveness of your response. So the first thing I want to mention is implicit responses mostly matter in the times in which you were not given the opportunity to respond. So in those opportunities, how do you assess implicit responses? So again, the scenario would be opening government has a very distinct frame, closing opposition has a very distinct frame. And you want to see if opening government was able to implicitly respond to closing opposition. And the way I would assess it is to look at what they have in common first. So it would be one, analysis of the shareholders. Maybe closing opposition says the shareholder will act in a certain way, but maybe opening government had already suggested otherwise. Maybe opening government actually did it even better than closing opposition. So even if closing opposition's argument is true, because opening government proved why they would not act in another way more likely, opening government's argument should be credited more. If there's nothing in common with the argumentation, it's unlikely an implicit response. So that's actually probably something you can use. I think that's a standard you can use to assess if implicit responses are even there to begin with, because you shouldn't also be fishing too hard as the judge for the implicit response. There are times where there just really isn't none. There are times where really closing opposition came up with a much more brilliant frame than their opening, and opening government really just was caught off guard in that debate. In those times, it's fair to mention that there was no implicit response. I think if you came to that conclusion, be sure to highlight that in your oral adjudication that you in light of opening government not having the opportunity to respond to the new frame of closing opposition, we as the panel deliberately and actively tried to determine if opening government's material had already preemptively responded to it. And then from there, you say whether or not you found something or whether or not you found nothing. Maybe you found something, but it wasn't compelling enough. Maybe you found nothing at all. Maybe you found something and that something was very compelling. So that's how I would assess implicit responses. Find out what's in common between the two arguments. It doesn't necessarily have to be identical analysis. It could just be a particular shareholder. Even if the shareholder are doing very different things, if one team argued that the shareholders likely to act in one way more than the other, benefit the one who proved the more likely version. So yeah, I think that unless there's like we can go like going once, going twice in the next in the next minute, and if there's still nobody, we can wrap this up. Yeah, because we did say we would have time for two more questions. We've answered one since then, so we still have time for one last. But if it reaches like 6:43 or 6:44, and there's still no questions, we can just call it. We can call it a night.
All right.
No, I have the stream open in my phone. It's really weird to see yourself on. Right, really weird to see myself on my phone in YouTube. Is this how you know you made it? Actually, I thought of one question to ask myself if ever there's nobody here who asks it. What do you do if you're a panel and you have a very unreasonable chair who doesn't give you the opportunity to speak? Frankly, on that, if it's so bad that the chair actually just stops you from speaking, you have the equity team to approach for these issues. If you are able to, if you have conducive evidence to prove that that was the case, you can also have the feedback for that round in particular, not like after by appealing it to Adjudicator, you can have the feedback for that round not considered when ranking you. So it isn't true that you're doomed if you're given a bad chair who doesn't give you the chance to speak. There are systems we have in place to be able to mitigate these things from happening. So that's like for the absolute worst case. If you have a chair who isn't really unreasonable, but you notice that they're not giving enough time to speak, it's okay, or at least it should be okay that you mention to this chair that it's okay if I speak. I feel like other people have been given disproportionately more time to speak compared to myself. I would like to share my responses to what they've shared so far. I don't think there should be any problem with somebody saying that. If anything, we should breed this culture that allows us to be more accountable to each other. And that's the only way we can achieve that.
All right. It seems we have run out of time for questions. So let's wrap this up. Thank you so much, Nico, for that amazing lecture. I'm sure people all over to see this video walk away more confident in their circuit's judge rules. On behalf of the PDU Executive Committee, let me just share screen right here.
Oh, I should stop sharing my screen then.
It's okay. We would like to award you the Certificate of Appreciation for sharing your time and expertise in the second part of the Philippine Debate Union workshop. So,
I really appreciate it.
for reminders for everybody watching, the stream will be edited and uploaded to the PDU Workshop YouTube channel. You may access all previous and future lectures there. Subscribe to us to keep tabs on our future workshop series. Follow the PDU page for updates on our next speakers and the next lecture topics the following week after. Lastly, in the chat, let's all show our gratitude for our exceptional lecturer for sharing some great insights on our judges' journeys of improvement. So, Nico, any last words before we end the stream?
Thank you so much to everyone. Everybody deserves to be heard, including judges. Just stick to what's comfortable. I don't know if that's a good wrap up of everything I wanted to share, but again, thank you guys so much for having me. I'll be more than happy to answer questions in the comments. More than happy to answer questions if you reach out to me privately.
Okay. Thank you so much. We'll be ending the stream now. Bye everyone and
Bye,
good luck.
everyone.